I had the idea that there was one region of this country that was still unexplored, and that was the canyons of the Green and Grand and Colorado River. We have an unknown canyon yet to explore, an unknown river to run. What falls there may be, we know not. What walls rise over the river, we know not. What rocks beset the channel, we know not. And it wasn't at all clear that we could survive it.
So tonight we're going to be doing a little bit of time traveling, and as some of you know, National Geographic is in the middle of celebrating its 125th year. We were founded 125 years ago here in Washington, D.C. at the Cosmo Club by 33 men, and one of those 33 men is our speaker tonight. How crazy is that, huh? Also, tomorrow, 125 years ago, we began the first lecture at National Geographic, and that first lecture was presented by our speaker tonight, John Wesley Powell. So it's a pleasure to have him here this evening. Won't you please join me in giving a warm National Geographic welcome to John Wesley Powell.
Good evening, everyone. My friends call me Wes, and my colleagues call me the Major, but the Ute and Paiute Indians, whose culture I studied for many, many years, called me Kaparats, one arm gone. Kaparats, arm missing. Such is the directness of the Indian mind. You know me, of course, for my great adventure down the Green and Colorado rivers in 1869. And so let me say this much. Most of the important work that I did was right here in Washington. I moved here in 1872 after my second Colorado journey. And I helped to establish the Cosmos Club in 1878. In fact, the first meeting of what would become the Cosmos Club was in the parlor of my house, not so very far from here. And as you just heard, on January 13th, 1888, I was one of 33 men who gathered at the Cosmos Club to create the National Geographic Society. I grew up in Ohio. My father was a tailor and an itinerant Methodist preacher and a part-time farmer and, generally speaking, a failure. And he expected me to become a farmer too. But that did not in any way appeal to me. I don't know what I would have done if it hadn't been for the Civil War. But the minute it happened, I joined the volunteer infantry and served in a range of different places. But at the Battle of Shiloh on April 6th, 1862, I was leading a charge over a ridge, and an unspent or nearly spent mini ball, that's a lead ball with a conical top, struck me just below the elbow and shattered it. 2 days later, without anesthetic of any sort, they sawed off my arm just below the elbow. That hurt. It never stopped me from doing a single thing in the course of my life. Now, after the Civil War, the country was a different place, and there was a lot of disillusionment in the East. And there was a sort of a sense that maybe there was a new beginning out West. I had the idea that there was one region of this country that was still unexplored, and that was the canyons of the Green and Grand and Colorado River. And so I decided to put together a small exploring party and see if it could be done. And we met at Green River Station, and we embarked on our journey down the Green in Colorado on the 24th of May, 1869. There were 10 of us to start. None of them were scientists. I didn't really even have scientific credentials at the time. 4 boats. Enough provisions for about 10 months. And off we went into the unknown on May 24th, 1869. I can't tell you all of the stories of our adventure, but I can give you, I think, a flavor of it. First, about the depths. We started at a flat place, then we would go down 1,000 feet into the earth, and then 3,000 feet, and eventually in the Grand Canyon we were 6,000 feet into the bowels of the earth. At a lecture that I gave when I came back, I said it would be as if there were a street like Broadway in New York, and there were skyscrapers on either side of that street, and they were 200 stories high for 600 miles. That's what it felt like. It was glorious. Every time we came around a bend in the river, we were seeing something that nobody had ever seen before. We had no idea what to expect. That's the nature of exploration, isn't it? 2 weeks into the excursion, in the Canyon of Lador, we had disaster. I had developed a series of flag and hand signals in the pilot boat. And if I made a certain sort of signal, then the men were to get to shore, and we would reconnoiter and maybe portage or line down the boats or see if there was a way to thread our way through the rapids. But for some reason, 3 of the boats came into shore, but the No Name, the 4th of the boats, did not get to shore. There was a long dispute later about what had happened, and it may be that they didn't see the signal, it may be that they ignored it. They said that the boat was so waterlogged that they were bailing and didn't see anything. But whatever it was, that 4th unfortunate boat, the No Name, went over the first rapid and recovered well enough, and then it struck a rock sideways and split in 2. The men were thrown from it, and most likely would have drowned if they hadn't washed up on a little sandbar in the middle of the river. Frank Goodman, the florid Englishman, found a rock, and he was holding on to it for dear life. Well, we rescued them, but now the No Name was gone, and with it all of the personal effects of the 3 men in the boat, Ormel and Seneca Howland and Frank Goodman, their clothing, their personal kits. Fully 1/3 of our provisions, including food, rifles, ammunition, and scientific instruments, were now lost. In fact, in searching through the other 3 boats, we discovered that for some unknown reason, we had packed all of the thermometers and barometers in the No Name. Now, we had very little pretensions to real science, but all of them were now gone. With a barometer, you can determine the altitude above camp of the cliffs, and the thermometers would be useful. And that night, I despaired. I thought I might leave the expedition and go overland to Salt Lake and bring back more barometers and see if we could piece it back together. But it was a time of great gloom. 1/3 of our provisions just 2 weeks into the expedition. The next morning, after a good sleep, we discovered that the No Name, at least part of the hull, had lodged against some rocks on the other side of the river. And so Jack Sumner and another man said that they would be willing to take the Emma Dean, the pilot boat, and see if they could go over there and determine if anything had been saved. And at some risk to themselves, they made their way across the rapids and to the wreckage. And you have to understand that when you're in the canyons, you can't hear a thing. It's like the sound of 10 freight trains going by at close proximity. And so it was a pantomime there. And they got to the hull of the No Name and they searched around it for a while, and then they held up a package, and it was the barometers. And so we were saved as a scientific expedition. And then they dug around some more, and then they were dancing in glee, and I had no idea that their commitment to science was what it was. But it turns out that they had secreted a keg of whiskey in the No Name. I'm a teetotaler. I had forbidden whiskey on this tour. They had secreted a keg, and it was intact. And so when they got back, I made an executive decision and decided to call that whiskey medicinal. But now we had crowded into the 3 remaining boats and moved on, chastened by the river. A few days later, just at the end of June 1869, we came to the mouth of the Uinta Creek. And if you follow that creek back up towards the west, you come to the Uinta Indian Agency. And I walked out to post some letters, and a couple of men went with me, including Frank Goodman. And when it was time to turn back, he said, "I've had enough." And so one member of the expedition had now retired. We were sorry to see him go, but with our reduced provisions and just 3 boats, it actually made a kind of sense. And so on we went. Eventually we came to the confluence of the Grand and the Green, which forms the Colorado proper. There's no way that I can describe it. All I can say is that the canyons are so deeply incised there that when you look up, you see a kind of a quarry, but not a quarry where castles are made, a quarry where mountains could be lifted out from the rocks. And the cliffs are so high that it's not the kind of place where you would see swallows having their nests part way up. You'd see eagles, and those eagles would disappear from sight before they reach the summit. It's one of the most amazing places on Earth, and it's a geologist's dream. You know, in England, geology is difficult because it's all covered with verdure. But here the country is exposed because of the aridity. And Earth reveals its skeleton and its spine and its entablature. It's a geologist's paradise. Our provisions by now were rotten. The flour was sour. The bacon was molded. There was nothing good to eat. And shortly after the disaster with the No Name, we had been making dinner on a little spot of sand at the beach. And unfortunately, Hawkins had caught the trees on fire right there, and they burned down the camp. And we got singed eyebrows and clothes burned, and we scrambled into the boats and went downriver. And Hawkins gathered up the cooking kit as best he could, and when he got to the boat, he tripped and lost almost all of it in the river. And so now we have spoiled food that we're cooking on 1 or 2 miserable pans. And it's about that point that we realized that we were in a race for life here. You can't really get out of these canyons. We had planned to hunt. There was not much to hunt. The bighorn sheep are high up and very skittish. There are almost no fish in these rivers, and the fish that we pulled out were like eating sandpaper that were pin cushions. And so we were beginning to wonder whether we would survive this expedition. And on we went. Well, finally, on August 6th, we came to the mouth of the Little Colorado River. And if you know that part of the world, that's really the beginning of the Grand Canyon. 4 wooden boats, now reduced to 3, all of them battered so much that we're caulking them almost every day. The men are mostly naked, living in rags. Our shoes are gone. The food is rancid and inadequate. We're exhausted mentally and physically. we were about to begin the most dangerous and challenging part of the journey, but we were spent. Now, if we had gone out at that point and regrouped and put some flesh back on our bones and written some letters home and relaxed a little and come back, we might have been able to do this with some ecstasy. But by the time we reached the portal of the Grand Canyon, we were in a pretty desperate state, and the rumblings of discontentment were beginning to reach even me. Here's what I wrote. We are now ready to begin on our way down the great unknown. Our boats, tied to a common stake, chafe each other as they are tossed by the fretful river. They ride high and buoyant, for their loads are lighter than we could desire. We have but a month's rations remaining. Our flour has all been resifted through our mosquito net sieve. The spoiled bacon has been dried and the worst of it boiled. Our few pounds of dried apples have been spread in the sun and reshrunken to their normal bulk. Our sugar has long since melted and gone on its way down the river, but we have a large bag of coffee. The lightning of the boats has this one advantage: they will ride the waves better, and we shall have but little to carry in the event of a portage. We are now 3/4 of a mile in the depths of the earth, and the great river shrinks into insignificance as it tosses its angry waves at the walls and cliffs that rise to the world above. Its waves are but puny ripples, and we but pygmies running up and down the sand or lost among the boulders. We have an unknown canyon yet to explore, an unknown river to run. What falls there may be, we know not. What walls rise over the river, we know not. What rocks beset the channel, we know not. Ah, well, the men talk as cheerfully as ever this morning. Jests are bandied about freely among them. And yet to me, the jests are ghastly and the cheer is somber. Even I, the optimist, began to call the Grand Canyon our prison. In terms of the magnificence of the scenery, there's nothing like it in the world. Its geological potential, unmatched. But we were now just hoping to survive. You know, Bradley, the sarcast, had written in his diary way back up at the Canyon of Lodore, I think all the way back at Flaming Gorge, he had written, "Today, we have seen the worst rapid that we have ever been through and the worst that we are ever likely to see." But he repeated that 19 times. He literally repeated that 19 times in the course of this journey. Had we been told before we started that the Grand Canyon would contain the kinds of rapids that it has, we never would have tried it. Ever. Well, finally, on the 27th of August, things fell apart. We came to the worst rapid that any of us had ever seen. And it wasn't at all clear that we could survive it. And so that day, Ormal Howland came to me and took me aside and said, "Major, we can't go on. It's suicide now to go on." He said, "What good would it be for us to die now at this late stage of the expedition and lose everything? What we should do is admit that we can't do it, not in our current condition and with these boats. And we'll climb the north face of the canyon, and we'll find our way to some Mormon villages. We'll regroup and maybe come back and do it another time. We can cache the boats. But if we go on, we're all going to die." Well, I said, if we try to climb out, we're probably going to die. It's not even clear you can climb out a mile up the north face of the Grand Canyon. I asked him who he spoke for, and he said his brother Seneca Howland and Bill Dunn, 3 of them. So we had supper, and then every man bedded down, and I went to each one of them, and I asked each one separately what he thought. And everyone but those 3 said they would see it through, that they weren't going to quit, that they wanted to go on. And so then I went back and woke up Ormel Howland and pleaded with him a little, tried to persuade him, and he said he could not be persuaded, and he knew that Seneca and Bill Dunn were finished also. And here's what I wrote. We have another little talk about tomorrow, and he lies down again. But for me, there is no sleep. All night long, I pace up and down a few yards of sand beach along by the river. Is it wise to go on? I go to the boats again to look at our rations. I feel certain we can get beyond the dangers immediately before us, but what may be below, I know not. From our position yesterday, high up on the cliffs, the river seemed to make another great bend to the south, which from our experience heretofore means more and higher granite walls. I'm not sure we can climb out of the canyon here. And when at the top of the wall, I know enough of the surrounding countryside to be certain that it is a desert of rock and sand between this and the nearest Mormon village, which on the most direct line must be at least 75 miles away. True, the late rains have been favorable to us should we climb out, for the chances are we shall find water standing in pools. And at one time, I almost decide to leave the river. But for years, I have been contemplating this trip. To say there is a part of the canyon I cannot explore, a part of the Colorado I cannot run, having already almost accomplished it, is more than I am willing to acknowledge, and I determined to go on. The breakfast was like a funeral. We made all the rest of our flour into biscuits, 2 little piles, and put them, one for those who were leaving and the other for the rest of us. We gave them rifles and ammunition, and all of our valuables, gold watches and any rings that we had, because we were pretty certain we weren't going to make it, and letters to our families. And then we said farewell and shook hands to the best men you could ever meet in your life. And we watched as they began to scramble up the north face of the Grand Canyon. And now, we had no choice but to face this thing. And Bradley agreed to go first, and one of the boats, we abandoned the Emma Dean now, so now we have 2 leaky boats left. And Bradley said he would go first to take a look, and so we lined him down with all the rope we still had in our possession. Got him as far out on that Herculean rapid as we could, and he was going to look to see what it looked like downriver. But the Colorado began to sway his boat back and forth like a pendulum, and it was riding from one cliff to the other and hitting the wall and then hitting the other wall, and it was certain that he would be smashed to smithereens. And so he took out his knife and he cut the rope. Over the falls he went. We were certain he was dead. And a minute or 2 later, his boat popped up, and he was alive, and he waved his hat like a rodeo cowboy. And now we did the stupidest thing we ever did. The rest of us got in the other boat without anything and just did it. We just popped over the thing. It was insane. And we were half drowned and waterlogged and scrambled to shore. We got out the rifles and fired repeatedly as a signal to the men, if they could, to climb back down and join us. But they didn't. Whether they heard us and didn't come, or whether they didn't hear us at all, we never learned. And there was one more significant rapid, and then we were out. Then we were at Grand Wash Cliffs. And from 6,000 feet, the cliffs diminished to nothing. And I wrote one of the last entries in my diary. I said, ever before us has been an unknown danger heavier than the immediate peril. Every waking hour we have spent in the Grand Canyon has been one of toil. We have watched with deep solicitude the steady disappearance of our scant supply of rations, and from time to time have watched as the river snatched away a little that was left to us while we were hungered. And toil and danger have been known in those great depths, where oft-times clouds hid the sky by day, and but a narrow zone of stars could be seen at night. Only during the few hours of deep sleep consequent on hard labor has the roar of the waters been hushed. But now the danger is over, now the toil has ceased, now the gloom has disappeared, and now the firmament is bounded only by the far horizon. And what a vast expanse of stars can now be seen. The river rolls by in silent majesty. The silence of our camp is sweet. Our joy is almost ecstasy. We sit up till after midnight talking of the Grand Canyon, talking of home, and talking principally of the three men who left us. Are they wandering around in these great depths, unable to find their way out? Are they scouring the plateau above in search of water? Or, as we hope, are they nearing the Mormon villages? Well, when we came out at Grand Wash Cliffs, there were 5 men waiting for us, 4 men and a boy. 4 of them were Mormons and 1 was an Indian, and they had been sent by Brigham Young. I was a friend of Young. He knew what we were doing, and he had sent them either to rescue us or to pick up whatever was left. And so they helped us, gave us food. This was the end of the journey for my brother Walter and me. We made our way overland to Salt Lake City, where we learned from the national press that the entire expedition had perished in the Canyon of Lodore. When I got back to civilization and corrected the erroneous press reports, I found that I was a hero, even a national hero. And congressmen wanted to talk with me and give me money and find places for me in Washington and fund for future expeditions. Well, let me just tie up this one loose end. The 3 men, Ormal and Seneca Howland and Bill Dunn, were able to climb out. They climbed a mile straight up. When they got to the north rim of the Grand Canyon, they made their way towards those settlements. Nobody knows what happened, but they died. I went back the following year to see if I could make sense of it, and it appears that they had some sort of a dark encounter with a group of Shivwits Indians. The Shivwits told me that somebody had raped a young Shivwits girl and that they reckoned that these were the culprits and so executed them. When I told them that that could not have happened, the Shivwits apologized and made a ceremony of reconciliation. Nobody knows for sure, but they died. I repeated the expedition in 1871 and 1872 with better boats and more science. I think we'll stop at this point because we're out of time, but here's what I'm going to do, if you don't mind. I'm going to remove this disgusting beard. Thanks.